I think that agriculture is at the threshold of a whole new revolution, and it's been through many revolutions. It's almost as if you're at a fork in the road.
What do you think sustainable agriculture means?
To make a living, to, I guess, provide something back to your community, to the public in general in regards to what you're doing.
Sustainable is sort of, as far as the definition, it defines itself. I mean, you're talking about something that's able to sustain production on its own. Organic agriculture, there's a difference. Sustainable is much broader.
Things the healthiest for the community and the people. And so that farming is not just a job, but it returns more to its art form.
These things are alive, and it's a nurturing process, and I think that's so neat.
You pay attention to the fine details, and you can actually understand what the land tells you. In sustainable agriculture, you have a place for these old breeds that in modern agriculture you don't.
Well, I've spent most of my life right here in Valley Cruces. I've lived here, I guess, 53 years. My mother's family was one of the oldest families in Vatauga County. They were here probably in the 1700s. And my father's family has been here since mid-1800s. The Churches came from Wilkes County and moved up into this area. My dad died when he was 45 years old. I was 10 at the time, and he was just getting to where he could farm and make a living good. We rented the farm for about 4 years and let someone else do the growing of the crops. And when I was 14, I started doing just about everything.
Father worked And because we didn't hire a lot of people who's more family oriented.
I took it over when I got married back in 1961. I farmed it for maybe 25 years. We had mules then.
Do it hard. Remember, the harder you do it, the less time you have to hold that foot up, right? Yes, please. But I want to be there when you do the hooves, okay?
After I stopped, I thought, I didn't have no idea that he would, start raising horses. I thought that might be the last of it,
And I'm the barn manager here. I am a certified instructor. And James and I basically have been doing a program for children in various organizations for 6 years.
I mainly try to teach a student how to be aware of what the horse is capable of doing and learn how to ride. You have to have good seat. And having good seat, the only things that, as far as a child, that would scare them, if they don't have good seat, they're going to fall off. And you have to know how to stop the animal. Those two things you have to know in that round pen. I have a round pen and a riding ring. They start out in the round pen. Once they learn how to ride well, and I think they're comfortable in the round pen, I'll take care of them to the riding ring. Watch me. All attention on me is very important. Your hands control your horse. Whatever you do with these hands, that's what you're asking the horse to do. So if your horse does this, what are you doing to the horse? You're pulling back on him, right? We do it for you? Let it go.
Unlike some places, they look at the land and they say, well, this very same land has been in our family for 7-some generations. Well, that's not totally been the case here. My dad had to buy most all the farm he has. He bought it from his father and relatives, but our people have farmed here, on generations, and a lot of changes. In fact, my great-grandfather was in South Carolina, and his way of farming and everything was incredible. He owned about a 3-mile strip of land from the Waccamaw River to the Atlantic Ocean, and most all of his livestock and stuff ran free. He fenced in the house.
My granddaddy was the first one that I remember being here. The 6th generation is living on the farm now.
1903, the fever come through here, and he died. Several of his sons died. Dr. Stone was the doctor tending to the family, and they were trading with the Stone brothers trading company in Little River. Due to the fact that there was no men to take care of the farm, and they owed the doctor and the Stone brothers for goods, they end up selling the farm. I could not understand why. I heard some people call it the Stone Farm, and then once in a while you hear somebody call it the Bellamy Farm.
Okay, and I grew up together. I was born in a little old cabin here at the corner of the building. Went to school together and knew each other all of our lives, and started dating at an early age, and our families knew each other.
In 1968, a neighbor and myself were digging for Indian arrowheads and pottery, and we dug out a skeleton that was over 2,000 years old. It predated the Cherokee Indians. It was what they called a woodland Indian. They migrated in here every spring from Tennessee, and they would spend the summers in here just like the modern tourists.
This part that we're on now belonged to Indians.
There were an Indian reservation back up in the sand field back there somewhat. And there are a lot of arrowheads and things there that you can even find some today.
On my mother's side of the family, we are direct descendants from Daniel Boone's father. His daughter Sarah Boone was our grandmother several times back.
The school was here and we had a bank. Of course, we had two stores. This store here and the one out that's an annex to this one, but it was a farthing store, farthing company. And then we had the mission school for the girls. It's been there all these years. And this lady had a dairy there, and she made ice cream. She made ice cream, and she had a little tea house.
There was no development. The mass store up here was just a regular country store. No tourists, maybe occasionally. But as far as the changes, there was no growth, no development. It was just a rural farming community. Everybody knew each other. Everybody went to school with each other's kids, and that was it.
Everybody at that time made their livelihood either from agriculture or fishing. I mean, there wasn't any building going on, so there wasn't no need for carpenters and all that at that particular time.
Where I went to school when I was in the 4th and 5th grade. My mother taught school in that building for several years, and it had two big stoves, one in each room, and in the wintertime the kids had to sit around the stove in a circle to keep from freezing.
We bought was sugar, salt, and pepper, the things like that. We had our own, and our flour, of course, but we had our own meal, and we always had a beef and pork and our chickens. So we had our own meats. We didn't have to buy meats. And when we had depression, we didn't really feel a depression except when we wanted a pair of shoes.
One of the best mules that ever lived. That's why you see the picture of that mule. I believe she was about 40-year-old.
That's what you know.
Old. But I plowed her many a day. And she was so good, so you could plow her without even lines. You could just talk to her. Gee, haul, or step up a little bit, or things like that. I mean, she just was a good mule.
It has started growing the last 10 or 15 years like mad. A lot of the older people are gone, and their home places have been sold, and people have bought the property where they could get it and have built houses all over in the woods and in the meadows and every place. The traffic in Veracruz is
Wasn't that many houses on the farm then, when I was growing up. Mostly clear land. And all these, buildings put up since then. You scattered farms and woods. And when I was young, there was no place to go except one man had a place at Little River, Vance Kinlaw, where they had square dances. And that was the activity. Myrtle Beach, Ocean Drive was just sand, and there was one old pavilion at North Myrtle Beach. And Calabash, you had a dirt road with a single trail. Going into it, if it was wet and it was real sandy, if you got in those ruts, the other person coming and have to wait. You eat the back tucker you got through on it up.
There'd be a house all back in the back. I guess 50 acres in there, I guess. House over all of it, man.
You know, you rarely saw a car, and now you're there. It's unbelievable. We rented a lot of farms during the time my dad farmed a lot of tobacco. And you might go from this place to another place, and you see. I would even meet other farmers going to a different farm, and now it's different. The population of cars has increased. Obviously, there are houses because people from the city, I'm assuming, are wanting that. Oh, I live out in the country now, but I'm not far from Raleigh.
I was growing up here, everybody had a farm. Everybody grew something or sold something that contributed to the food chain. They sold cattle, or they sold potatoes, milk, chickens. They sold something. And you knew everybody in the valley. You knew everybody, you knew all their family, you knew where they lived. And now, the farms are gone. You would have to really look to find anybody that grows anything for sale.
With what we've got here now, it's about 300 acres. And there's a number of different directions you can go with that much and do it all together like it is.
You know, we realized that we didn't want to depend on tobacco. In fact, Dad really believed there were better things to grow than tobacco. So in 1976, you know, that was our last year.
That was our cash crop for years, tobacco. But the reason I quit is a little different from most people. My wife had 2 sisters had lung cancer. And then another brother had lung cancer, and they were all heavy smokers. And I quit.
Like on tobacco, the prices now look like gone down to what they were when I was farming.
By 1970, if a person had 125 sows, you know, they could make a living. You know, today you can't do that. Actually, we purposely got out of the hog business because we didn't feel like it was moving in the same direction that we were headed. And contract farming was becoming such a necessity. On a farm our size, diversity is always key.
And we'd always planned a large garden, so we decided to increase it a little and have vegetables and strawberries. So the first year we sold them under the trees out beside the house there. And then we built a little stand, which I thought he meant a stand, but it turned out to be a $10,000 building stand. And we've been in it ever since 1980. We do the farm school tours and hay rides, nighttime hay rides, plus the parties for children. Sam does parties for the children, he and Sally.
What are some of the things that Indigo Farms does to help educate the community that maybe other farms don't?
Well, we have school tours, and in the spring and fall, where we have guides that take the children through the barnyard and tell them about the grains or the animals and plants and the differences in animals and some things about animals that you don't notice, like goats and cows and sheep don't have top front teeth. And for a lot of these kids that have never had the option of opening a goat's mouth, they don't know that. And then we have Farm Heritage Day, where we have people from the area come and talk about the past and the present and when they were growing up, before McDonald's was so common.
One of them lays sort of like an olive green. I'll take them in and wash them and grade them. I have a little egg scale, and then I'll put them in cartons and sell them up at the store.
I also believe that farms are an incredibly good place to develop a world and life view. And in education, I think that that's one of the most fundamental and primary things that needs to be done.
That's the Buff-Orpington, which is what Andy is, and Sam is Buff-Orpington, Rhode Island Red Cross. They're good setters. They are fairly good layers. They're very good meat birds. I think that's about it.
The things about sustainable agriculture that's so important is that it's true that science is a very big part of farming. But it's not just science, it's an art.
Came over and asked if we'd be willing to grow a patch of broccoli and see if it would be a viable crop for this area. And surprisingly, it did good. We probably sold over 4,000 pounds of broccoli on that first acre. And when you compare that with what we were used to on tobacco, the broccoli was paying twice as much or more than the tobacco. It's going to look attractive to other farmers who would like to quit depending on tobacco, entirely as their only crop. Organic food is coming to be a very desired item. People are getting so health conscious, and with the terrorist attacks, people are worried about food safety. Why grow a bag of potatoes for $8 when you can grow it for $25 with not much more work? Where I look at it is the bottom line.
I don't believe in the way fertilizer is used in this day and age. It's over-fertilized. It really is. I mean, they turn around and say, you don't know what damage you're going to do 50 years down the road, the way they're growing it now and the way they're fertilizing it now. I just don't agree with it. I think you can only take so much out of the earth before you put it back in, and organic gardening, to me, is the way to go.
Now, let's try to put in this one. I pointed the wrong one. I'm sorry. Ready? You want to go and see where the eggs come from, and you give them eggs here. And summertime students, that sometimes we compost the manure when we take it out of the stalls. Some horse farms will bulk pile it, and that's fine. But I just try to bring it out and create beds. And during the winter time, I plant them in the, planting in the spring of the year.
You can raise turkeys more traditionally with historical breeds and do just as well or better and put less time and effort and money into them and have healthier, more active birds that benefit not only the people that will eventually benefit from them, but the land that they were in and the crops they were with. Maybe keeping them under orchards and so forth to help eliminate bugs. Traditional turkey breeds that are hardy and active, like they needed them to be years ago, don't require a whole lot of grain. they can actually find bugs and grass and that stuff for themselves.
Do a lot with Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, do merit badges, you know, for Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Indian princes, mother daughters, you know, we do trail rides.
Well, she may not be here. She's a maiden baby.
If you get that template down, I guess, I think you can make it like that. You know, just, I love what I do. I'm not making a lot of money, but I love what I do. That's why years ago, things were harder then. They did ate out of the freezer. They had their meats on the farm. These little things, I believe, make a big difference. That's just trying to look at that and say, can you make it without borrowing money? Because I went back and started buying the corn, buying the oats, supplementing with the feed that I normally would buy. I'm just trying to think old school way, so to speak. In the downtime, doing more building, just doing more marketing, grade the place aesthetically, trying to make it more appealing because I'm dealing with the public. To me, I've always been around farms all my life, so I know what they basically look like. You know, you don't have time to put all your equipment in a row and everything might not be whatever, but they think it's supposed to be like that.
And Alex, my grandson, we were out there picking one day and I had a school group come by. And one of the little boys said, look at there. Said, they picking bananas. And it was yellow squash. See, that's how much a lot of children know about how things grow. That's one reason why we do that.
When we're working in the fields in the summertime, people stop every day. And a lot of them are just amazed at what it takes to do a certain task, you know, to get a crop to market. So, you know, it's a good thing for people to go out and see things like that. They need to understand it. I feel sorry for people in cities that have no idea how anything is grown.
For the most part, Indian towns really look like they're not only...
Unfortunately, the number of farmers are so few. It's hard to get a real good consensus. The non-farming communities really don't know what it's like farming.
I've always kept a job on the side. In fact, I do construction work, bulldozing and backhoe work, dump truck and custom farm work. Anything that somebody can talk me into doing, we'll do it if we can make some money at it. And that's why I've been able to farm. I've paid most of the farm bills from construction work.
You know, our taxes here is really expensive. More out of a house taxes than it could really a farm, you know. More people you got have houses, more income they have for taxes. The way I see it now.
A small farmer cannot make a living just on the farm if he wants anything other than a couple of meals a week.
And what's happening currently is you're having a lot of farmers scratching their heads saying, well, what can I grow to make a living? And I guess the ironic thing is you're seeing some of these same farmers who are growing 200 acres of tobacco, maybe having 1,000 head of cows, they're the ones just scratching their head. That's what's amazing to me. What I anticipate happening is you're going to find more and more people growing produce. I already see it. They're growing it, and now they're wondering where can they sell it. This is part of the dilemma of agriculture. You know, you're encouraging farmers to make a shift, but you need to know how are you going to market it? How's it all going to affect everything else? And there's no agriculture sector that is doing so well, but what they're not looking for something better. Even the biggest guys, nobody feels really secure. Even the guys with the contracts, you know, they have that contract, but it's been known in the past that buyouts and changes of contracts, and many times many times if you ask them, they really don't know whether it's working. They feel like they're putting all their labor in it, but what are they really getting long term?
I love doing this, but right now, it's not easy when you're not borrowing money. I'm not going to say it is.
It's a dying breed, no doubt. The average farmer's age is probably in the mid-60s. Young people don't want to take up the farm because if they had the money to buy what it takes to run a farm, they could do anything they wanted to.
The farmers are being squeezed out. They really are. A lot of them's going to work on the beaches, and but we still have some hanging in here trying.
Price is not right. Really like the work when I was coming. They looked like the prices got worse instead of better. I think I went out at a good time. Really, you can make it so much better, I guess, than being out in the hot sun and then don't get paid at the fall till the fall, and then sometime you don't get paid.
Farms being bought by someone else and they're setting on them to get paid, as people want to come in this area more so. That's happening a decent amount around here. You see a lot of farms now that are going up for sale.
We've developed systems where we think, that this is the way to farm. And we've come around and we've said, well, and we do this with other countries. We talk in terms of if they had the technology, that would increase their productivity. For them. What has it done for us? I mean, it's caused, basically to have overproduction, and the margin of profit has certainly done nothing but go less, and that's not been healthy for farmers. And unfortunately, the remedies that have been suggested have all been sort of moving us in a direction that industrializes agriculture.
Let's see, there's 3 tobacco farms, and the others are just growing corn and grain and stuff, and well, actually there's 4 tobacco farms, but they just lease.
I wrote a poem one time a few years ago during the time that when you watch TV at night, all you saw was the farms in the Midwest being auctioned off and all the belongings and equipment of the farmers being sold at auction. And one Sunday morning sitting in church, I wrote a poem about that. Rarely sees a farmer's tears or knows of his breaking heart when he knows that his life will be auctioned and from his land he must depart. All he ever asks for is a very simple life, his home and loving family, and his partner, his loving wife. A farmer's life is honest, his wants are very few. He always tries to live his life by God's golden rule. Good crops in the fields are riches in a true farmer's eyes. A newborn calf that's healthy gives him the highest of highs. The farmer feels forsaken by the ones who govern this land. It seems they want to punish him for being an independent man. It's the farmer's hard work and doing without that fills the nation's plates. His reward is a deaf ear in Congress and unfair interest rates. When will the world wake up and begin to understand the ones they need to hold on to most are the ones who work the land? Someday when stores are empty and hunger does its harm, then everyone will wonder why there's no one left to farm.
So to go and just say, oh, they offer me what? I don't even look at that. That's just me. It's not. I don't care what they offer you, but it's not worth it to me. Whatever you offer me, I'm still not interested.
They're asking $5 million for this place down here, this Frank Beard farm.
I believe the ones that are selling off had no original attachment to the land.
I would like to think it would stay a farm. The biggest problem are my kids being able to make enough money to be able to afford to keep it a farm. When I'm not here any longer, they're going to have to figure out if they want to continue doing it or They want to sell it and make the big dollars and do something else. So.
Well, I love doing this, but right now, you know, it's not easy when you're not.
But Charles, as long as he lives, he'll farm. He loves it, and he never stops. He goes day and night.
It was all I ever was around. I knew how to do it. I'd learned it since I was a kid, and I loved it. It was in my blood, I guess, and it still is. Even though I've found out the terrible secret that farmers don't make a lot of money, I still love to do it.
I mean, I just like to see things grow, and there's a lot of things I don't like. I mean, when you have too cold of weather like this, and too dry and too wet, I mean, that all comes in, but it's part of it. But I just ever since I was real small, I just like to see things grow. And that's life. See, even at 74, I can put in some 20-hour days.
You know, with tomatoes, simple things like tomatoes. You know, you might give your customer, you know, have any tomatoes in your garden? No, not yet. You know, that type of thing. Just little simple things to make. That's what farm type people are like. You're kind.
Why did you choose to stay here and farm when some of your other family didn't?
Because of my father, you know. I tried to carry it on for him. One thing you could, you're on your own, you know. You don't have nobody standing over you. And your next day's work, you knew exactly what you wanted to do, you know. And that makes a lot of difference than going on a public job, you know. You have to tell you, it makes a difference, less pressures on you when you're in one way. I always enjoy growing different things, you know. Yeah, after the rain, you could just about next day or so, you could even see it growing, you know. Yeah.
I have no intentions of selling anything myself. If I want to remain doing what I'm doing, I will stay here because the money's is in Cary, Raleigh, you know, that time. The money's is one thing, but the memories to me, like I told you before, there's no comparison for me.
That's another thing we'd like to do with our farm is incorporate more of those things into it so that it's healthier, more relaxing, and so the future farm can be better than either the present or the past farms by combining both. I think right now it looks like I could be working with the agritourism part of Indigo Farms, working with the market and the livestock, and educating people and helping people interact with the farm and helping the farm benefit the community more. So.
I'm over here every weekend and every summer to work, so yeah, I'll probably stay around in this area. Yeah. I think I'll come over here and work for him later on in my life.
You know, it's up to them. It's up to them.
Daddy does this a lot better. I'm not going.
What are the bright spots that we have
Well,
to look forward to?
The bright spot that you have to look forward to now is that a new generation is taking over in offices, on the farm, wherever you go. It's younger people. These people my age that came in with the chemical era in about 1950 are now retired or they're gone. I just had a conversation with a man who worked for the Texas Environmental Department, and he was telling me how that they were coping with dressing the cuts they make when they put in a new highway. They shoot up some compost on it, and next thing you know, they've got a green cover crop of some side going. Well, that wouldn't happen under the old regime because they wouldn't even listen to it, because they were out there spraying Roundup and so on. That's what's changing, is the changeover of personnel. That's on agriculture, on the farms. Young people downsized out of work in industrial America are going back, taking over the family farms, creating a cash flow and making it work. And they're doing this because they have a new insight and innovation to bring back with them, things they've learned off of the farm. So now they have to learn about agriculture again.
One of the things that come up over and over again in acres is looking at your inputs, your fertility inputs, in two ways. One, to make you get through this season and to bring the crop in, but also to look at improving the soil over time.
Absolutely, and this is what most of the innovative products will do, and this is something that the research facilities, either at the university or the land grant at the university or at the USDA, have still to deal with, and they have a hard time dealing with it. What is the cumulative effect? It goes, beyond 3 years. People who have been using some of these pasture maintenance products for 10 years, all of a sudden they've got a completely different setup over what it was before. And the little 2, 3, 4 year research plot won't answer that question. But we're finding the answer just in practice.
What's some of the positive feedback you get from people that go to the Acres Conference on how it's really changed them and how they're happy about that?
Well, usually about 18% of the farmers who come to Acres USA are chemical farmers. Not very many of them continue that after they leave. It's almost an epiphany or a life-changing experience in many cases. They see the error of what's happened. I've had farmers come up to me and tell me they lost their wife, and now they know why. She was doing that laundry with those chemicals in it, and she got cancer and she died. It just hits them like a thunderbolt. And of course we have young people. The crowds are getting younger every year. And I think that's really the part that gives me a big kick, because after all, I'm getting up there in years. I won't be here very much longer, but my son is about half as old as I am. He's going to be able to carry this on another 30, 40 years. And he's going to have to find somebody to succeed. And by then it won't be needed quite as much as it was 30 years ago.
We see a lot of examples of good knowledge coming from science, but also a lot of really innovative stuff coming just from the farmer. Do you have examples of where that's really worked well?
Well, I think what the farmer has done he's gone back and recaptured the values. Some of these findings were made at the beginning of the last century. I have some in mind that came out of Russian literature, out of Israeli literature, out of various parts of the world. Not too much of what you're seeing happening, even at the research station and so on, is really that new. We've been there before. What happened is we kicked it out the door about 1949 when we set up the poison control centers and decided we were going to farm that way.
What do you think is the future for the family farm?
I think the farms are going to get smaller, and it's going to be the family farm all over again. And here's my reasoning on it. About 1950, the judgment was made by USDA and the public policy of the United States to put the land into a few strong hands. Well, the grain, the big storable commodities are in big strong hands, and all of them are bankrupt. Take their subsidy away from them, and they can't put out the next crop. They'll tell you that themselves. Go to the internet, you can see how much that they're drawing in the mailbox by counties for the whole United States. That's your basic storable commodity farmers that account for about 82% of the harvested acres. Coming on strong are the specialty farmers, and they are family farmers. What we really need is a program to take young families and give them an apprenticeship on the farm, teach them how to do it, and then let them go find their farm and proceed. They did that back in the last part of the 30s. An old associate of mine, Lee Fryer, worked with the administration that took farmers in tow, put them on a farm for 5 years with a payout procedure that was workable. What happened?
Just leave it on the ground.
And what they did was train those farmers for 5 years, and then a lot of the farmers you have in this valley here in the Rio Grande Valley, that's where they got their training. Was out here at that what is now going to be, what did they call it, the first farm we visited?
Rio Farms?
Rio Farm, yeah.
I think that's what's happening.
Sometimes we see regulations that are trying to help us actually interfere with the best interest in our health. Can you use milk as an example of that?
I think I would be probably the first thing I would select was milk. We've written milk codes now that are about 2 inches thick in every state in the Union, and the idea was that we were guarding the people against milk-borne diseases. We haven't had a milk-borne disease in the United States since the 30s, when we had a little bit of brucellosis or the human variation thereof, which was undulant fever. So now you've got to homogenize the milk. You've got to take the butter fat out of it. They're pasteurizing it. And the idea is that milk is inherently full of pathogens. Well, milk is not inherently full of pathogens. Milk is absolutely the cleanest product there is if you don't fill those cows full of antibiotics or feed them those antibiotics and these medicines and things like that and keep them on pasture. It's when you take a cow and put her in a stanchion and don't let her move and don't let her have those 25 cubic feet of fresh air she needs to breathe every minute, that you start incubating pathogens and passing them on into the milk. So the pasteurization process, that will do some good if it's worked correctly, but it's a very tricky process. And if it's not hot enough or too hot and isn't just perfect, and the machinery isn't working just right, chances are you got a worse milk product than you had in the first place. Now, if you take California, University of California, Davis recently tested the cow platters from cows kept out there on pasture, where they're handled in a sanitary manner. They weren't passing pathogens all over the pasture. As a matter of fact, they took some of those pathogens and put them into the fresh raw milk, and they couldn't survive. The milk has to be contaminated to start with, and the contamination comes from the cow that's not maintained properly. These codes are largely nonsense. They've been bypassed. They need to be repealed. However, we do need to have a good watch on it. The milk needs to be tested. We need to have a good sanitary product going into the market, and it's happening in California especially. Most states it's not happening because they have these laws, and they need to be repealed.
Whenever I mention Acres USA, everybody I talk to is just so excited about the wealth of knowledge that's in all your published materials, all your books. One of the things you have done is sat with some of the great minds in eco-agriculture and pulled books out of them. What is your formula for going to someone and doing that?
Well, since the beginning of Acres USA, I've carried an interview section every month. And I've counted for maybe 400 of those so far. A third of those people that I've interviewed are now gone. If we hadn't have downloaded what they knew, they'd have passed from the mind and memory of man and nobody would know about it. So I started out with Dr. Albrecht. I had day-long Socrates sessions with him with a tape recorder running, downloading that man's mind. 2 or 3 years later, he was gone. We wouldn't have that information in a large measure if we hadn't have bothered to take it down. I've done that with hundreds of others. And the system is simply go back to old Socrates, ask some questions, and don't be afraid to ask dumb questions, because probably you will ask some dumb ones you don't know. But you're not going to find out if you don't ask. And the people who have accumulated a lifetime of knowledge are always going to be wiser than somebody that's fresh out of college with a PhD degree.
Farming in a sustainable manner where you're really trying to optimize the health properties of the plant while improving the soil and the environment at the same time is a different paradigm. What would you say are some of the major things that we need to keep in mind when we're trying to do that?
I would say that the anatomy of insect and weed control, which after all is the big central problem of agriculture. The anatomy of weed and insect control is seated in fertility management. If you give that plant the nutrition it needs to construct its own hormone and enzyme systems, it'll take care of its insect problem, and largely it'll take care of its weed problem. And I think we forgot that when we went to legislated formulas. We were going to require 20 units of N, P, and K and those kind of things. We have to go back and ask nature what nature has to say and comply with nature. Now, you just heard a talk by Malcolm Beck on unusual fertility assistance. He found that ash out of the fireplace was of value. Molasses was of great value. And we can go on and fill books with this. Well, this is what these biologically correct farmers know instinctively, and by having recaptured the values, and by listening to old-timers, and now by it's being recovered from literature that's being made available to people who are interested.
There seems like so much of the science that's coming out now about what's going on with the microbiology in the soil just says that the techniques were right.
That's correct. That's validated. But you see, those techniques were discovered 30, 40, 80 years ago. I have texts out of Russia that were translated by Israeli that are telling us what we're trying to find out and rediscovering the wheel right now. And it has to do with microbiology. Now, admittedly, we have some better tools now. We got better microscopes. We have machines that will, spectrometers that will send the soil sample through and give us an instant readout. But we have to question some of those things that do it on the industrial basis when we find out that doing the soil test 6 at a time is superior.
Can I ask you a real personal question?
Sure.
Who is Charles Walters Jr.?
Well, that's me. I grew up in western Kansas in the Dust Bowl. We migrated out of the Dust Bowl and were trying to get on our feet when the war came, and I volunteered. I served in World War II. I served in the Korean War. I didn't see any action, though, because I happened to be positioned just at the time when we were heading to the Pacific, why the bombs were dropped, so it was all over and the career came to an end. But I never got back to a farm. My father and mother both passed away later on. They lived the ripe old ages. But I went to Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. I took a master's degree in economics at the University of Denver. And I got into publishing after a brief auditing career. I used to do audits from Baltimore up to Boston, and I came back to Denver and wrote copy for things like Rodeo Sports News and trade papers. And then I got a job being an editor on a veterinary medicine magazine, Veterinary Medicine. I was assistant publisher. Well, the old gentleman died who was running it, and the estate sold it to a new group of people, so I went to work for the National Farmers Organization. I really got an education at the National Farmers Organization because that's where I met Carl Wilkin, who is the subject of Unforgiven. It was while writing Unforgiven that it came to me in the last few chapters when I was doing some statistical work that we were increasing our inputs geometrically, but we were only increasing our production arithmetically, kind of a Malthusian equation. That's when I got interested enough to read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The rest you know. After Silent Spring, there was no turning back. I started Acres USA, and it's been a learning process as much as a dispensing of information process, because I don't know everything. I have to rely on people who know. And the ones who know most of all, I find, were the old gentlemen, 80, 90 years old, ready to cross over. And nobody was bothering to download what they had to say. And that's where I concentrated my effort.
Well, I speak for thousands and thousands of people when I say, thank you, Chuck Walters.
Okay, is that enough footage, you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good work.
You ought to be able to clip something out of all of that.
Oh, it'll do fine.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking time with us.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'll take you back to the
We are going to stay tight on 50 minutes for speaker times. And I have the pleasure of introducing a gentleman here that's one of my personal heroes, and he really needs no introduction. Charles Walters started Acres USA about 34 years ago. And it is a wonderful little magazine. I think it should be required reading for all the people in the country who would really understand what's going on with our food supply. It took me about 2 years of reading Acres USA to understand what parity meant, which is a farmer getting a fair dollar for what they're trying to do. If you want a good grasp on that, you should read Unforgiven. But let me introduce Mr. Charles Walters. Thank you, sir.
catch who's coming in and who's going out. If you start falling asleep, why, go back there and pick up an Acres. You can be reading it. And I'll tell you a little background of how I came to start a magazine when there were already 305 of them in existence in the United States pertaining to agriculture. Why would there be one more? It all started when I was writing a book called Unforgiven. I was working with the National Farmers Organization at the time, and I discovered something by the time I got to about page 400, doing some numbers. We were increasing the inputs in agriculture geometrically, but we were only increasing the production arithmetically, sort of a Malthusian equation. And I let out a long, low whistle, and I think that's really when the idea of publishing Acres USA came into being. It's no use to put everything in a book because books don't circulate that widely. They're beautiful warehouses for information. But in order to make a dent into what the situation we had developed, I concluded that you had to have something hitting the market or hitting the people who were interested at least once a month. I met Senator Yarborough up in Minneapolis one time, and we were talking backstage. And I asked him, a lot of questions, and he told me something that stayed with me. He said, if you want 50% of the people to know something in a community, it has to be on the front page of a well-circulated daily 8 days in a row. Well, I was asking him, how do you keep getting elected? How do you do that, considering the campaign? He said, well, once you're in, he says, it's simple. You just go back to Texas every once in a while and beat up on Congress. Well, I'm not going to beat up on Congress. God knows we're not going to beat up on USDA anymore after what we saw yesterday. Why is this thing acting like a heartbeat, I wonder?
It's okay.
Is it because I'm dragging the cord around too much?
No.
But I will tell you, one of my best friends came up to me after the last Acres USA meeting, and he says, you're getting sour, you better get a little humor back into the situation. So I thought I'd tell you this as an opener. About a couple of cowboys, they were out there having a roundup, and Joe, he says, I was listening to the radio the other night, and boy, don't this beat the band. There's 180 million critters grazing on this land. And Fred, he says, he was calculating with his little computer, and he said, boys, looky here. Supposing all them critters was one gigantic steer. Why, that thing would weigh 100 million tons. He'd reach from coast to coast. He'd eat a jillion tons of hay, and God knows. Here's what I like the most. His fur hind leg would be in Buffalo, his front one in Pomona, at Tacoma, his left rear hoof would be in Jacksonville, and his fourth one in Pomona. And after he had all that hay, wouldn't there be a fuss? What he did to Washington's, what Washington's did to us? It's been 60 years this year since I last shot a machine gun or squeezed into the turret of a bomber. That career and that war ended rather abruptly when 2 of our B-29s flew over the crowded cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's a connection between those events and the founding of Acres USA. And I'm going to try to connect the dots a little bit. Because overnight, we all learned about radiation. Man, woman, and child, student, and old people all of a sudden found out, if they didn't know before, that radiation intercepted the cell and created unwanted mutations. We knew that, of course, since Madame Curie found an ore that gave up its energy without apparent measurable loss of its mass. And so it wasn't August 14, 1945, that the era in which we live came to an old one ended and a new one started. But it was April 25, 1953 that best denotes this new era. The bombers flew over those two cities in 1945. But it was 1953 that James Watson and Francis Crick published the DNA model in Nature magazine. Now, the DNA had been photographed before by Rosalind Franklin at King's College in England with the help of Maurice Wilkins. Yeah, thank you. She would have gotten the Nobel Prize, except for one thing. She had untimely died. The Nobel Prizes are only given to people who are still living. So it was Watson and Crick and Wilkins who became the icons, the scientific icons that govern our civilization, and whether you know it or not, our agriculture. I'm going to set that information to one side for right now, kind of consider it a sidebar to the major point I'd like to make here this morning. And that is to make clear to you what the connection is between agriculture as practiced and agriculture as we want it practiced. I don't know. In 1933, Roosevelt managed to get passed the War Powers Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And the purpose of that act was for the government to solve the farm problem. This was an awesome task, considering that we didn't even understand 1929 yet. And so, basically, here's what happened. The government took over agriculture because it decided it was going to direct and control the crops from 82% of the harvested acres. These were basically your soybeans, your corn, your wheat, your milo, and rice, and things like that. They left afloat the specialty crops, the oranges, those 500 crops that are grown in California. And the question was, how would they raise farm income? The first step that was taken was Roosevelt raised by executive decree the price of corn from 10 cents a bushel to 55 cents a bushel. And later on in his administration in 1937, he got parity up to 70%. This against a hostile Congress who didn't understand it. They were relying on the work of George Warren. George Warren was a professor who went around the country with variegated colored charts, and he was teaching people how it was was that agriculture was not being paid for as much wealth as it produced. That information was published in USDA Bulletin number 999, and he explained how parity operated. Now, the announcer said that it took him 2 years to understand parity. I hope to do a little better than that. Parity for agriculture is nothing more than paying the farmer at least as much as the guy that's pushing the broom in Grand Central Station for his effort. I had a chart I'd hoped to show you that your crops are basically solar revenue harvested through the agency of photosynthesis and chlorophyll in plants. We never pay the sun back. The rest of the economy, except for minerals and a few things like that, oil, the rest of the economy is merely taking money out of this pocket and moving it over to somebody else's pocket. I hear him talk about we have a football team in town and it generates so and so much money. The fact of the matter is the football team doesn't generate any money at all. It merely moves the money out of somebody else's pocket into the pocket of the team's owners. This is the case with most of the service industries. And that makes agriculture the flywheel and the balance wheel of the economy. And yet, the whole economy operates on the basis. It operates on the basis of having that solar revenue monetized, which is production times price. And if you can't cover your costs of production, that's why you end up working for nothing or working for less than the guy that pushes the broom. Parity simply says if you want an economy that has full employment, that has no destruction of price structure through import invasion, then you have to have all the segments of the economy in harmony with each other. In 1937, they got the parity up to 70% through the intervention of National Association of Commissioners, Directors, and administrators of state agricultural agencies. That was jumped to 100% of parity immediately when World War II broke out. And for the next 10 years, American agriculture operated under a parity arrangement. We were paying the farmer for as much as his crop was worth. That's all that means. Did anybody catch that message at all? Have I still got a canvas painted with people out there? Let me hear from you. Well, we'll have to try again later. The question is, how much did this cost the government? It didn't cost the government anything, because the basic storable commodities from 82% of the harvested acres had to achieve a par arrangement with wages and capital costs or they couldn't go into market. As a matter of fact, the government during that 10-year period made a little bit of profit on it because occasionally somebody would pass away and they took over the crop in storage and sold it. And so it didn't cost the government anything to maintain that type of prosperity for agriculture. Those farmers that were trained out here under the Farm Resettlement Administration, they all became prosperous farmers during that period if they finished their term of training and moved out onto the land. Now, what was wrong with that? Mr. Truman managed to balance his budgets, but there's one deficit, and that is your banks found it difficult to find borrowers for the money that they had available to be loaned out under the fractional reserve system. You're going to have to prompt me a little, Ann.
Ezra Taft Benson.
Oh, yeah, let's not forget Ezra Taft Benson. Let's back up a little bit. In 1946, they passed the Employment Act of that year. And the idea was that the nation would no longer tolerate unemployment or inflation. The only thing that really came out of that act was the President's Economic Report. It was administered by Edwin Norris and Leon Kaiserling. But 2 years later, in 1948, the war ended because the War Stabilization Act of 1942 was written so that it would expire 2 years after the president had pronounced the war over. And that meant that at the end of 1948, parity was closed down. So there was a big fight in Congress in 1948. And finally, they passed what they called the Aiken Bill. And it said that we were not going to have par arrangements for agriculture any longer unless it was 60 to 90% of parity at the discretion of the Secretary of Agriculture. Various intermediate steps were taken to continue this until the Eisenhower administration took over. And that's when Mr. Ezra Taft Benson said, we're not going to mollycoddle the farmers any longer. They're going to have to make their way against the world's competition. Well, we didn't have the economy the world had. We had people making a living here, and we didn't have the poverty levels and a few hundred other things. But agriculture was struck down. And the 9 administrations since then, Democrat and Republicans, have taken agriculture down a notch each time, irregardless of the War Stabilization Act or the War Powers Act. This is quite illegal. The boys took it to court. They got it as far as the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refused to hear the fact that the law was not being enforced. That is when we went to industrial agriculture. When that parity was sunk down, we imported in the next 5 years about $5 billion worth of commodities, the same ones we raised here. Now, if any of you ever get a hold of a little book we've put out, I haven't put it out, and Acres hasn't put it out, but the National Organization for Raw Materials has. It's called An Economic Report of the Producers. The purpose of that little book was to answer the President's Economic Report, because the President's Economic Report has concluded that we've got too many farmers. We've got to get the land into a few strong hands. We've got to get industrial-sized farms. This thinking was engineered by the Committee for Economic Development. It found its way into the President's Economic Report, and we are here to respond to that, and I've been doing it now for a couple of years, so if you ever get a hold of any of those, which you can through the NORM organization, and I'm sure the Toga can tell you how, you can see that if you import 1% of a commodity in terms of domestic production, in many cases, 1%, in case of cotton, 0.5%, you will crash the American price down to a support level, if there is one, or to the world level. I was working for the National Farmers Organization, and we couldn't figure out, this was in the 60s, we couldn't figure out why we couldn't get a price. We were well organized, but still. And I finally presented the president with the finding that I made. If you import 1%, they thought he had to import 30%. I said, no, if they import 1% of the wheat, your wheat price is going to be down to the world level where the traders want it. In the case of cotton 3 years ago, they brought in 1/2 of 1% cotton in terms of domestic production from India and China, and it crashed cotton down approximately 50%. That is one factor. The second factor I told the president was that maybe we're getting parity for our production. We're producing junk and we're getting junk prices. We're producing wheat that doesn't have the protein in it, the wheat my father grew without any of this fancy stuff. We're not getting it in corn, we're not getting it in rice. In other words, these are substandard crops. And I went to the president and I said, why instead of rolling pigs, shooting pigs and rolling them into a trench and dumping milk, why don't we take this organization and take the lead in giving America clean food? I didn't get very far with that, I'll tell you right now. But about 4 or 5 months later, I left and proceeded to start Acres USA. I didn't know for sure where we were going with it. It was kind of like dumping an ink well on a blotter paper to see which way the capillary action took it. The first time after the first issue was out, the first time I went out to talk to a farm group, I went out to talk to the Jackson County Fruit Growers Association. Now, about all the conversation went that night was they seemed to be spraying 21 times a year instead of the 3 times they'd sprayed 7 or 8 years before. And I got up to make my pitch a little bit. And I'm going to tell you, I think I was lucky to get out of there alive. I'm sorry?
Rachel Carson.
Oh, yeah. Anyway, in 1949, they established the poison control centers. That was so the doctors would know who to call when the farmers got into trouble farming the industrial way with all these toxic genetic chemicals. At that time, or a little before, Sir Albert Howard, the Britisher, made a famous statement. He said, at the end of the war, 2 false premises swept the republics of learning: partial and imbalanced fertilization and toxic rescue chemistry. Wheeler McMillan of the Farm Journal was writing editorials. He said, too many farmers, we got to get the country thinned out. There's just no way that they can make a living and compete in the world and feed the world. The chemical industry at that point moved in and they settled in for the long haul. It took almost 10 years before the dissenting voices were heard. My favorite quotation is one I found in Silent Spring. We are rightly appalled by the genetic effects of radiation. How then are we so indifferent to the same effect from farm chemicals used widely in the environment? I confess I must have spent 8, 10 issues explaining that in the first few issues of the first year or so of Acres USA. I had a little hard time with it myself until I got a hold of the chemistry prize winner of the Brussels World Fair, a man named Americo Mosco from Turin, Italy. And he explained to me that the effects of fallout, as in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, and the chemicals used in agriculture were the same damage was the same because the ionization of these chemicals in touch with plants, animals, and human beings had the same genetic effect. He went on to explain that the cell is composed of chromosomes, and these chromosomes are made up of information-bearing genes. And these genes are interdicted when there's starvation involved, improper nutrition, when there's radiation, or when there are radiomimetic chemicals. What that means is these are chemicals that mimic radiation. They have the same effect. The cell can go on and reproduce the induced error, or it can live. It can die. But if it continues to live, the induced error can go into wild proliferation, which is cancer. Now, the Centers for Disease Control tell us that 1 out of every 2.18 people in the United States can expect cancer at some time in their lifetime. Much of this is a consequence of this chemistry on, around, and in the food supply. This problem wasn't new. It was considered way back in the 30s by a rather unique organization that met at Malabar Farm. Louis Bromfield had been all over the world. He was a famous novelist. He wrote When the Rains Came and some of those books they made into Hollywood movies. And when he got back, he bought up these rundown farms in Ohio, and he started restoring them. And the great professors of that era, Dr. William A. Albrecht, Cyrus Hopkins, Furman Baird, some of those people, they met there over and over again at Louis' place, and they were examining what are we doing with this salt fertilizers and toxic rescue chemistry. It was to Albrecht that I went when the time came to structure Acres USA. And he helped me frame some of the principles that we have followed ever since in our journalistic endeavor. The first one was that simplistic, I think was the word he used. Simplistic use of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NP and K fertilizers, mean malnutrition because of a shortage or a marked imbalance of essential nutrients. The second principle he told me to use was remember that plants in touch with the appropriate loads of nutrients have the capability of structuring their own hormone and enzyme systems that can ward off viral, bacterial, fungal, and insect attacks. The third thing, we concluded that the insects were there for a reason. The Creator had sent them to get rid of stuff that in the evolutionary scheme of things really wasn't fit to live. Of course, we put poisons on it so we can eat the sick stuff. Then there was a fourth principle. He said weeds are an index of what's wrong with the soil, and sometimes what's right with the soil. And he said, learn to read those indexes, and you will have some sort of an indication of what fertility amendment you have to make to get around the problem. Now, we applaud what we heard yesterday, using safe insecticides and using the sterile fly system for controlling infestations that have run amok and so on. But the real control of insects still resides in fertility management. Then Dr. Albrecht said, remember, plants that suffer because of mild cold snaps or drought don't really suffer or die because of the mild cold or drought, because of malnutrition in their fertility system. So you can always get around another few degrees, one way or the other, if you keep that in mind. Now, what about those pesticides? Some of the greatest scientists in the world say that they have no safe level and they have no tolerance level. They spin off an electron which makes them unbalanced. And once they become unbalanced, that's when they perform their mischief on you, you see. Now, when we started out the paper, we started talking about some of these things, and the first reaction I got is, well, you're way over our heads. Well, I said, you're going to have to raise your heads because we can't come down. So it was quite a struggle for about 10 years to, I imagine some of you have tried to start a small farm or anything like that, where you're trying to capitalize on savings and expand on earnings, know exactly what I'm talking about. It is a real hard struggle, but we made it, and I guess the basic lessons that I've brought into the field, and which have been enlarged upon by all kinds of investigators and all kinds of businesses that have opened up, came straight out of 800 papers that Dr. Albrecht parked on my desk. He said, now don't think that these are 800 different articles. They're not. Sometimes he says, I just changed the title and the audience. But those papers were harnessed, and they were based basically on 39 research plots, 10th acre plots, 86, some of them had been in service 86 years at the time Dr. Albrecht died. Now what he did was showed the effects of rotation and some of the deficits. He showed what you could do with green manure and what were some of the drawbacks to green manure. He always had a flip side. It wasn't always pure as the driven snow with each lesson. He told us about the basic requirements for calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. And he showed us a formula which many of our people are using, especially Neil Kinsey, that works as well in Canada as it does in the Caribbean islands in terms of measuring out the fertility that you're going to have to account for. But most of all, he says, you cannot achieve the perfection you want until you get your natural nitrogen cycle working and you get your natural carbon cycle working. The little lady out here the other day, if you were on the tour, had a real good demonstration of the carbon thing. You're going to have to prompt me again because I'm trying.
Well, poison control centers.
Oh yeah, I told about that.
Oh, DNA.
Well, okay, I did mention the DNA, Francis Crick and so on. Now the DNA was discovered identified in 1953. What they said was that all of life is organized according to a ladder with 4 chemicals. adenine, cysteine, guanine, and tritine, I think, tryptine. These are usually represented as A, C, and G, T. Now, A always pairs with T, and C pairs with G. And what we're doing nowadays is intercepting those letters, and they call that genetic engineering, and then let it go and see what happens. The Japanese have taken the position that they aren't going to go for genetic engineering, and Europe has said the same thing, and India has said the same thing. We're not going to find out until we see what happens to a generation of Americans. I don't know what happens on all of it. I do know what happens in potatoes. The work done in Scotland, it turned out that the test animals all had distorted vital organs, intestines that were too thin, others were organs were too thick, and it wasn't a wholesome thing because they couldn't have much of a life expectancy. I do know what happens in corn. There is a fusarium mold. It's very microscopic. That goes with genetically modified corn. Now you feed that corn to an animal, they may make it to the door or to the gate, but they're being hurt. They're being debilitated. Of course, we get them into the feedlot, keep them there 90 days, cram them full of bicarbonate of soda and a few other things, and see to it that they're slaughtered before we find something's wrong, like mad cow, I guess. The scientists have decided that they could marry traits from unlike species at the molecular level by using a molecular scissor and putting that particular viral agent into the chain, into the ladder, into the double helix. And that's what that's all about. Oh, I do know this. The United States is just about the only advanced country in the world that's using bovine somatropin. Canada won't allow it. Europe won't allow it. I don't believe Australia and New Zealand are allowing it. And it's not being allowed in most of South America. So there's something seriously wrong. The only answer that I see to any of these things is the organic movement, the sustainable movement, growing livestock and crops without the obscene presence, most of all, of the toxic rescue chemistry, and of course, antibiotics. I had an interview the other day with a fellow in California. He's selling fresh, raw milk to the market, which is allowed in California if you can pass the tests. Well, he's discovered that the cows, measuring their droppings, do not put out pathogens if you don't fill them full of antibiotics to start with, and if you keep them on grass. He doesn't even bring them into the barn to milk them. He takes the barn to the cattle. He's got about 6 docking places around the place at different pastures, pulls out there, starts up the engine, and milks the cows right there. They don't have to travel a half a mile to be milked. He sells the milk on the farm and has a truck takes it out to about 98 different retail distributors. And he says people are just delirious when they get a hold of fresh milk and fresh cream. And this is the kind of innovation that I've seen all along since we started publishing Acres about 34 years ago. Some are more sophisticated than the others. One thing that I see happening is a lot of people coming back to the farm, taking over the old home place or buying some acreage or something, who have computers computer training. One fellow I know was a pneumatic engineer, downsized out of a job. Went back, he's now producing chickens, free-range chickens, beef, lambs, and he's made a connection with a bunch of Amish farmers and is now at their retail end. So these are some of the bright pluses. When I started Acres USA, there wasn't, I think there were one or two groups, natural food associates in the country, addressing any of this. Now there are units and organizations in every state in the country, sometimes 2 or 3 in a state. I don't remember how long it's been since the Texas organization started, but I think we were here first. And so NFA was here, but NFA has closed shop because it's been absorbed by successor organizations that were more able to do the job, and that's only natural in the scheme of things. These are a few thoughts I thought I'd leave with you this morning. I would add one thing. This is a little personal. I grew up out in western Kansas. A bunch of German immigrants. They had been here since about 1896 or 76. 96, some of them came. But they were very cooperative people. And I saw a loss of that cooperation when I worked with the National Farmers Organization. Too many farmers were standing there at the fence line of their neighbor and say, oh, Mike's not doing too good. That crop doesn't, I think he's going to go broke. And they were licking their chops, and here was land that ran beyond the dream of avarice. They could pick it up and get bigger and get more efficient and grow more and sell it for less, I guess. I don't see that in the organic movement. In New York, I know of one group that gets together every week or month, depending on the seasons of the year, and their main function is to address problems that their members have, to see if some of the others have that problem. I once brought this to the attention of my dad, and Dad always had a saying, you know. He said, well, these people nowadays in agriculture have got the soul of a Russian peasant. And I said, what do you mean? And he explained it to me, and I'll explain it to you now. God came to Ivan, and he said, Ivan, you're the soul of the earth. You're the soul of the earth. You feed the people, you tend to the land, you make it fruitful, and you make the crops multiply. I've decided to give you any wish you want. But he says, you want more money, more rubles? I'll make you a millionaire. No, I don't want to be a millionaire. I'm a farmer. I want to hold my head up. And he said, well, I'll give you more land. Well, that would be nice. I could have about double what I got. He says, or you can have better crops, as many crops on the land you got. Double harvest. That would even be better at the vodka clutch if I... He said, but God said, know this. Whatever you elect and whatever happens to you happens double to your neighbor Vladimir. Farmer says, oh my God. I'd love to have more money and more land and more crops. But that scoundrel Vladimir would have double what I have. I'd never be able to show myself in public again. So finally he went back and he said, God, put out one of my eyes. We don't want to be the type of people that worry about the neighbor. We want to get in there and help the neighbor. We don't want him blind and us half blind. And that, I think, is the message I'd like to leave you with today. Thank you for
Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break before the next speaker. Louise will be here in about 10 minutes to introduce.